In a brightly lit hospital corridor, under the quiet authority of machines that measured a baby's fragile heartbeat, Melanie Carter stood holding her feverish daughter. Nurses moved quickly around her. A doctor asked careful questions. Roman Carter glanced at his phone, then he stepped away. No argument, no explanation. Just distance created in front of witnesses who understood exactly what it meant. "I'll be back," he said. He wasn't. What he didn't know was that before sunrise, another call had already been made, one that did not ask him to return. If you believe silence is not weakness, stay with this story until the end. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I read every comment. And if stories about truth, dignity, and quiet justice matter to you, consider subscribing. By the time the automatic doors of the emergency entrance sealed shut behind Roman Carter, the night had already decided what it would become. Inside, under the harsh fluorescence of the pediatric wing, Melanie Carter did not move for several seconds. Not because she expected him to come back immediately, but because her body had not yet caught up with what her mind had already understood. In her arms, Ivy Carter burned with heat that did not belong to a child so small. The nurse who had been asking intake questions paused just briefly, her eyes flicking toward the door Roman had used. She did not ask where he had gone. In places like this, people learned quickly which questions had no answers worth hearing. "Ma'am," the nurse said gently, redirecting, "how long has the fever been this high?" Melanie adjusted Ivy slightly, pressing her cheek against the baby's damp forehead. "Since late afternoon. It spiked around 9. Her voice was steady. Not calm, implied ease. This was something else. It was control carefully held in place. They moved her into a small exam room, the kind designed for speed rather than comfort. A narrow bed, a rolling stool, a monitor that beeped in patient, indifferent rhythm. Melanie sat. Ivy whimpered weakly, her tiny fingers curling against the fabric of Melanie's shirt. A doctor entered, already scanning the chart. "We're going to run a few tests," he said, efficient, but not unkind. "Infants can turn quickly with fevers like this." Melanie nodded. She had already read that. Twice, earlier that evening. Alone. Roman had been there then too. Sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone while she measured temperature, then measured it again, as if the second reading might contradict the first. Probably nothing he had said at the time without looking up. But he had gotten dressed quickly when she said they were going to the hospital. He had driven. He had walked beside her through the entrance. He had stayed until he didn't. The tests began. Blood work, a nasal swab. Gentle but precise movements from nurses who had done this hundreds of times before. Ivy cried, once a thin, exhausted sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Melanie murmured to her low and constant. Not words exactly, just presence. Time stretched in uneven increments. 10 minutes, 20, 45. Melanie checked her phone once. No messages, no missed calls. She placed it face down on the chair beside her. An hour passed before the first results came back. Not definitive, not reassuring either. "We'd like to keep her for observation," the doctor said. "Just to be safe." Melanie nodded again. Of course. Safe was no longer a word that meant comfort. It meant vigilance. A different nurse came into place in Ivy. Ivy's tiny arm looked impossibly small against the tape and tubing. Melanie watched closely, not because she doubted the nurse's skill, but because watching was the only thing she could do. At some point, someone offered her water. She took it, thanked them, and forgot to drink it. The chair beside her remained empty. She noticed it only in the way one notices a missing step after the foot has already fallen through air. Around 2 in the morning, the hallway quieted. Fewer footsteps, softer voices, machines continuing their quiet work without interruption. Melanie stood briefly, shifting Ivy's weight, and walked the length of the small room. Not pacing, just moving enough to keep her muscles from locking. She looked at her phone again. Still nothing. No explanation. No update. No running late. Nothing that could be mistaken for an attempt. It would have been easier in some ways if there had been anger earlier. A raised voice. A slammed door. Something loud enough to hold on to. But Roman had never been loud. He had always been measured, controlled. Even now his absence carried that same precision. It did not announce itself. It simply replaced what should have been there. Melanie sat again. She adjusted the blanket around Ivy, tucking it gently under her chin. The baby's breathing had steadied slightly, though the heat had not fully broken. Melanie leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. No longer. When she opened them again, something had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else in the room would notice. But internally, the space where uncertainty had been was no longer undefined. It had shape now. This was not the first time Roman had stepped away when he should have stayed. It was simply the first time it had happened where the cost could not be minimized. Her mind began organizing without instruction. Timeline. Arrival 10:12 p.m. Initial assessment 10:25. Roman leaves approximately 10:40. No return. No contact. She did not reach for her notebook. There would be time for that later. But the structure was already there, forming quietly line by line. At 3:07 a.m., Ivy stirred more strongly, letting out a small cry that carried more strength than before. The nurse checked her vitals again. "Fever's coming down a bit," she said. "That's a good sign." Melanie nodded. Good sign, not resolution, but movement. She brushed her fingers lightly over Ivy's hair, damp but cooling. Outside the room, a cart rolled past, wheels clicking softly against the tile. Melanie picked up her phone. This time, she did not check for messages. She opened her contacts, scrolled, paused. There were several numbers she could have called. Friends, a neighbor, someone from the base community, people who would have come, who would have asked questions, who would have offered comfort shaped like conversation. But comfort was not what she needed. Not tonight. Her thumb moved slightly further down. She found the number she had seen only once before, written at the bottom of an official document Roman had left on the kitchen counter weeks ago. She had not memorized it intentionally, but she had not forgotten it either. The office of his commanding officer. Melanie looked at Ivy. The baby's breathing had settled into a fragile rhythm, one that required attention, but no longer immediate alarm. Melanie stood careful not to disturb the IV line and stepped just outside the room. The hallway was nearly empty now. A nurse at the far desk glanced up briefly, then returned to her chart. Melanie dialed. It rang longer than she expected. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, a voice answered, not fully alert, but trained to become so quickly. "This is Captain Hayes." Melanie did not rush. "My name is Melanie Carter," she said. "I'm calling regarding Staff Sergeant Roman Carter." A pause. Not confusion, recognition. "Yes, ma'am," he said, more awake now. "What's the situation?" Melanie's voice did not change. "Our daughter was admitted to the ER tonight with a high fever. He left during intake and has not returned. I believe you should be aware." She did not add emotion. She did not add accusation. She did not need to. On the other end, silence stretched for a fraction longer than before. "I understand," Captain Hayes said finally. "Thank you for informing me." Melanie nodded, though he could not see it. That's all she said. She ended the call. No shaking hands, no second guessing. She stood there for a moment longer, then returned to the room. Ivy stirred again, softer this time. Melanie sat adjusting the blanket once more. The chair beside her remained empty, but it no longer felt like a question, only a fact. And facts once clear had a way of moving forward on their own. Long before the hospital corridor, before the quiet hum of machines and the measured voices of nurses, Melanie Carter had learned how to live inside a structure that looked stable from the outside. It began the way many military marriages did, quickly, efficiently, and with a sense of certainty that felt stronger than time. She met Roman Carter at a small gathering just outside Fort Redstone. The kind of place where introductions were made in complete sentences and departures were always early. He stood out immediately, not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were deliberate, measured and clean. He carried himself like someone who understood expectations and met them. Melanie noticed that first. Others noticed it too. At the time, it felt like reliability. Later, it would reveal itself as something else. Their courtship did not stretch. It moved forward with quiet momentum. Roman was attentive in ways that appeared thoughtful. He remembered small details arrived on time and spoke about the future in a tone that suggested it had already been arranged. Melanie, who had always valued steadiness over spectacle, found comfort in that. There were no dramatic declarations, no sweeping gestures, just consistency, or what looked like it. They married within the year. The transition into military life required adjustment. But Melanie adapted with a kind of quiet discipline that matched Roman's outward demeanor. Moves were expected. Time apart was normal. Plans shifted without warning. She learned to build routines that could be taken apart and rebuilt elsewhere. She kept lists. She tracked schedules. She learned which things could be controlled and which could not. Roman, for his part, continued to perform exactly as expected, at least where others could see him. He maintained his appearance meticulously, uniform pressed, boots polished, language precise. In public settings, he was attentive, respectful, and composed. Other spouses commented on it, sometimes how fortunate Melanie was to have someone so grounded, so dependable. She would smile politely. At that time, she believed it too. The first small fracture did not arrive as a break. It came as an omission, a missed dinner he had promised to attend. There was a reasonable explanation, there always was. A last-minute duty change, a scheduling conflict, something that sounded legitimate enough to dismiss concern. Melanie adjusted. She reheated the meal the next day. It was a small thing. Small things, when isolated, rarely demand attention. But they do accumulate. Over time, patterns began to form, not loud enough to confront, but consistent enough to register. Roman's phone became more private, not secretive in a dramatic sense. He did not hide it outright. He simply kept it closer, screen angled slightly away, notifications silenced more often than before. When Melanie would enter a room unexpectedly, he did not flinch. He just locked the screen, smoothly, as if it were part of the same controlled movement he used for everything else. Conversations changed too, though subtly. When Melanie asked about his day, his answers became more structured. Not shorter, but less open. He provided information without inviting follow-up. It was the difference between reporting and sharing. At first, she told herself it was stress. Military life carried pressure she could not fully see. It was reasonable that he might withdraw slightly. Reasonable things, when repeated often enough, can begin to disguise unreasonable patterns. After Ivy was born, the shift deepened. The pregnancy had not been easy. Melanie had carried most of it quietly, attending appointments, tracking symptoms, preparing the home with the same methodical care she applied to everything. Roman had been present, but presence, she would later understand, was not the same as participation. He attended the major milestones, the appointments that mattered, the moments that could be recounted later in conversation. But the smaller, continuous work, the adjustments, the nightly discomfort, the mental load, remained largely hers. Again, nothing dramatic. Just absence in increments. When Ivy arrived, fragile and new, Melanie's world narrowed to a single focus: feeding schedules, sleep cycles, temperature checks. She moved through each day with precision, not because she preferred it, but because the margin for error felt too small. Roman adapted differently. At first, he was attentive in bursts, holding Ivy for short periods, asking practical questions, offering help in ways that could be completed quickly. But over time, those moments became less frequent. He returned to longer hours, more time outside the house. Explanations remained consistent duty training obligations, each one plausible, each one difficult to challenge without sounding unreasonable. Melanie did not argue. She observed. Observation became her way of maintaining clarity. It started unconsciously. She would notice the time he left, the time he returned, the gap between them. At first, it remained in her mind. But memory, she realized, could shift under pressure. So she began writing things down. Nothing elaborate. A simple notebook, dates, times, short descriptions. Left at 6:40 p.m. Said training ran late. Returned 11:15 p.m. No prior message. Phone call outside. 14 minutes. There was no accusation in the entries. No interpretation. Just record. At the time, she told herself it was to keep track of routine. But beneath that, something else was forming. A need for consistency. For truth that did not depend on explanation. Roman noticed the notebook once. It sat on the kitchen counter open but angled away. He glanced at it, then at her. "What's that for?" he asked casually. "Schedules," Melanie replied. He nodded, did not ask further. That was his way. He did not push where he believed there was nothing to gain. The distance between them did not expand all at once. It widened gradually like a crack in glass that spreads without sound. Conversations became functional. Meals were quieter. Shared moments shorter. There were still outward signs of normalcy, shared errands, occasional conversations, brief acknowledgments of routine life. To anyone observing from the outside, it would have appeared intact. But internally, the structure had shifted. Melanie did not name it immediately. Naming something requires certainty, and certainty takes time. What she did recognize was inconsistency, and inconsistency, when repeated, becomes a pattern. She began cross-referencing without realizing she was doing it. A late return aligned with a missing receipt, a long shift that did not match the timing of a base schedule she had come to understand over the years. A message tone she did not recognize. Each detail alone was insignificant. Together they formed something else. Still, she did not confront him, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something fundamental about Roman Carter. He did not respond to emotion. He responded to control, and control required information. So she continued to observe, to record, to wait. By the time Ivy's fever spiked that night, the notebook was no longer just a collection of observations. It was a timeline, incomplete but structured. And when Roman walked out of the hospital room, leaving behind a child who needed him and a wife who had stopped expecting explanations, the final piece did not surprise her. It confirmed. Back in the hospital, as Ivy's breathing steadied under careful monitoring, Melanie sat in the same chair she had occupied for hours. Her posture had not changed. Her expression had not shifted. But internally, something had settled into place. The past no longer needed interpretation. It had already been documented. And the future, though still uncertain, would no longer depend on what Roman chose to say, only on what he had already done. Rachel Bennett did not think of herself as someone who stepped into other people's lives uninvited. If asked, she would have said she believed in timing, in connection, in the quiet recognition that sometimes arrived between two people before logic had time to intervene. She had met Roman Carter at a networking event just outside the base, one of those semi-formal gatherings where civilians and military personnel overlapped briefly, exchanging names, roles, and carefully measured conversations. Roman had introduced himself without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Roman Carter. His tone had been steady, confident but not aggressive. Rachel noticed that immediately. He listened when she spoke. He asked questions that suggested attention rather than obligation. And when the conversation ended, he did not linger unnecessarily. He simply said it had been a pleasure and moved on. That more than anything made an impression. Men who tried too hard were easy to dismiss. Men who appeared composed, controlled, those were harder to read. Rachel did not pursue him, but she did not forget him either. The next interaction came through a message. Brief, neutral. Good to see you again earlier. Hope your week's going well. She had hesitated before responding, not because of suspicion, but because of instinct. There was something about the timing that felt deliberate. Still, she replied. That was how it began. Not with intensity, not with urgency, just a steady exchange of messages that slowly expanded beyond formality. Roman shared small details about his life, work pressures, long hours, the strain of responsibility. He spoke of marriage, but only in fragments. Things have been distant for a while. We're not really connecting anymore. I'm trying, but it feels one-sided. Rachel did not question those statements at first. They fit a pattern she had heard before relationships that had lost balance partners who remained out of obligation rather than connection. It sounded familiar, reasonable. What Roman did not say mattered more. He did not mention Ivy. Not at the beginning. Not during the early conversations that built trust through selective honesty. Rachel filled in the gaps with assumptions that felt natural. That the marriage was already failing. That separation, formal or informal, was inevitable. That she was not stepping into something intact, but something already broken. Roman allowed those assumptions to exist. He did not correct them. Their communication shifted gradually. Messages became longer, more personal. He began calling. Late evenings at first, then earlier. Always with an explanation for why the timing worked. Just got out of something. Had a break. Wanted to hear your voice. Rachel noticed that he rarely called from inside his home. Background noise was minimal, controlled. There were no interruptions, no voices that suggested a shared space. It reinforced the version of reality she had accepted. One where Roman was already emotionally alone. The first time she asked directly about his marriage, his answer was measured. We're still legally together, he said. But it's not really a marriage anymore. He did not elaborate. Rachel did not press. Some silences feel respectful. Others, in retrospect, reveal themselves as omissions. Their first in-person meeting outside the initial event was planned carefully. A restaurant not too close to the base. Not too far either. Neutral ground. Roman arrived on time. Of course he did. He always did. He carried himself the same way he had before composed, attentive, controlled. If there was tension, it did not show. Conversation flowed easily. He asked about her work, her interests. He listened. When he spoke, he chose his words with precision. Rachel found herself relaxing in ways she had not expected. It felt uncomplicated, or at least it appeared that way. Over time, the meetings became more frequent, still structured, still contained. Roman maintained boundaries not out of restraint, but out of management. He decided when they met, how long they stayed, when he left, always with a reason, always with consistency. Rachel noticed patterns, but they did not immediately register as concern. He avoided certain times of day. He rarely stayed overnight. He did not invite her into his personal space, but he explained those choices in ways that aligned with the narrative he had already built. It's complicated right now. I don't want to create more conflict. I'm trying to handle things the right way. The right way. The phrase carried weight without definition. Rachel accepted it because it sounded responsible, because it suggested intention, because it allowed her to believe she was part of something that would eventually resolve. The first inconsistency appeared in something small, a delay in response, not unusual on its own. But when he did reply, the explanation did not match the timing. I was tied up with work. Yet the timestamp suggested otherwise. Rachel noticed, but she dismissed it. People misremember details. It happens. The second inconsistency was less subtle. A canceled plan, last minute. Something came up. No further detail. The next day, he was attentive again, more engaged, as if compensating for absence. Rachel felt the shift, but again she adjusted. Patterns do not become clear until they repeat. What she did not see, what she could not see, was the full structure behind those gaps. The hospital visits, the late nights at home that were not work-related, the presence of a child whose needs dictated everything Melanie did. Roman existed in two timelines. With Rachel, he was controlled, composed, selectively vulnerable. With Melanie, he was distant, efficient, and increasingly absent. Both versions were consistent within themselves. That was his skill. Not deception through chaos, but through structure. Melanie became aware of Rachel not through confrontation, but through accumulation. A message preview that lingered too long on a screen. A name that appeared more than once. A pattern of timing that did not align with anything she could verify. She did not react immediately. Instead, she began observing more closely. One evening, while Roman stepped outside to take a call, Melanie remained inside, standing near the kitchen counter. The window was slightly open, not enough to hear everything, but enough to catch fragments. "I told you it's basically over." A pause. "No, she doesn't." Another pause. "I'll figure it out." The words were incomplete, but they were sufficient. Melanie did not move. She did not confront him when he came back inside. She did not ask who he had been speaking to. Instead, she returned to the routine she had already established. Observation. Documentation. She began taking screenshots when possible. Not obsessively. Not impulsively. Only when something presented itself clearly enough to capture without intrusion. Names, times, partial messages. She compared them against her notes, against his stated schedule, against the reality she lived each day. The alignment was not perfect, but it did not need to be. It was enough. Rachel, meanwhile, continued moving forward within the version of truth she had been given. She sensed that Roman was holding something back, but not the extent of it, not the parts that would have forced a different decision. Roman believed he was maintaining control of timing, of information, of perception. What he did not account for was the difference between being believed and being verified. Melanie did not need access to everything. She only needed enough. Enough to see the pattern, enough to confirm the inconsistency, enough to stop relying on explanation. By the time Ivy's fever rose and the hospital lights replaced the quiet of their home, the existence of Rachel Bennett was no longer a suspicion. It was a factor, not yet fully defined, but present. And in Melanie's world, once something became real, it did not remain abstract for long. It found its place in the record. Roman Carter returned home the following afternoon with the same controlled composure he had always relied on. The door closed behind him with a soft, deliberate click. Not too loud. Never too loud. Melanie was in the living room, seated near the window, where natural light fell across the floor in a narrow, pale strip. Ivy slept in a bassinet beside her, the rise and fall of her chest still slightly uneven, but no longer urgent. Roman paused just inside the doorway. He took in the scene quickly, not emotionally, but observationally. "Hey," he said, his voice even as if he had stepped out briefly rather than disappeared for hours. Melanie looked up, not sharply, not slowly, just enough to acknowledge his presence. "You're back," she said. There was no emphasis on the words, no accusation, no relief, just recognition. Roman nodded once, setting his keys down in their usual place. "I had to handle something," he added, removing his jacket with practiced ease. The explanation was delivered the way all of his explanations were structured, complete enough to sound reasonable, but without detail that could be questioned. Melanie did not ask what the something had been. Instead, she shifted her gaze briefly toward Ivy. "The fever's down," she said. "They released us early this morning." Roman stepped closer to the bassinet. He leaned slightly, looking at the baby. "Good," he said. A single word. It landed without weight. He reached out, adjusting the edge of the blanket near Ivy's shoulder. The gesture appeared careful, attentive. To anyone observing from the outside, it would have looked like concern. Melanie watched his hand. Not the movement, but the timing. He had not asked how high the fever had been. He had not asked what tests were run. He had not asked how long they had stayed. Only the outcome. Good. He straightened, turning his attention back to Melanie. "You should have called me," he said. The sentence was soft, almost gentle. But it carried a subtle shift in direction, responsibility redirected. Melanie held his gaze for a moment. "I did," she said. Roman's expression did not change. When he asked, "After you left?" she replied. Another pause. Measured. Controlled. "I didn't get anything," he said. It was not defensive. It was not aggressive. It was simply positioned. Melanie nodded once. "I see." She did not reach for her phone. She did not show the call log. She did not need to. The statement had already been placed. Roman moved toward the kitchen, opening the refrigerator, as if continuing a routine that had never been interrupted. "Did they say what caused it?" he asked, his voice carrying from the other room. "Not definitively," Melanie answered. "They're monitoring for infection." Roman closed the refrigerator, taking out a bottle of water. "That makes sense," he said. He leaned against the counter, unscrewing the cap. The conversation remained functional. Information exchanged without connection. It could have continued that way indefinitely. In many ways, it already had. But something had shifted quietly beneath the surface. Roman sensed it, though he could not yet define it. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no demand for explanation. And yet the space between them felt different, less flexible, more defined. He took a sip of water, watching Melanie from across the room. "You look tired," he said. It sounded like concern, but it also sounded like assessment. "I am," Melanie replied. She did not elaborate. Roman nodded as if confirming something. "You should get some rest," he said. "I can take over for a bit." The offer was presented smoothly, timed correctly. Melanie considered it for a moment, not because she needed the rest, but because she was measuring the intention. "Thank you," she said. "I'll stay with her." Roman accepted the answer without resistance. "All right." He set the bottle down. The moment passed, but not entirely. Later that evening, as the light outside faded and the house settled into its usual quiet, Roman's phone rang. He glanced at it immediately. Too quickly. Melanie noticed. Of course she did. He stood already, moving toward the hallway. "I'll take this," he said. She nodded. No objection, no question. Roman stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The same pattern, the same structure. Melanie remained seated, her hand resting lightly on the edge of Ivy's bassinet. She listened not to the conversation itself, which was muffled beyond recognition, but to the rhythm, the duration, the pacing. 12 minutes. She counted without looking at a clock. When Roman returned, his expression was unchanged. Neutral, composed. He resumed his place in the room, as if nothing had occurred. Melanie did not ask who had called. Instead, she reached for the small notebook on the side table. Opened it. Wrote, date, time, call outside, approx. 12 minutes. She closed it again. Roman noticed the movement this time. "What are you writing?" he asked. His tone remained casual, but there was something sharper beneath it. Just keeping track of things, Melanie said. Like what schedules? Timing. Roman held her gaze for a second longer than before. Why, he asked. The question was simple. The answer did not need to be. Melanie tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to respond. "It helps me stay organized," she said. Roman nodded slowly. Right. He did not press further, but the question lingered. Later that night, after Ivy had settled into a more stable sleep, Roman stepped into the bedroom. Melanie followed shortly after, moving quietly so as not to disturb the baby monitor's sensitive range. Roman was already sitting on the edge of the bed, his phone in his hand. He set it down as she entered. Another small movement. Controlled. "You didn't have to call anyone," he said suddenly. Melanie paused. She knew exactly what he meant, but she did not respond immediately. "I wanted to make sure everything was documented," she said finally. Roman's jaw tightened just slightly. "Documented," he repeated. "Yes." The words settled between them. Roman leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "That seems unnecessary," he said. Melanie met his gaze. "I don't think it is." Silence followed, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. Roman shifted his weight, his posture adjusting as if recalibrating. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. Melanie did not respond. She had heard variations of that sentence before. Different words. Same structure. Minimize, redirect, contain. This time it did not land the same way. Roman watched her, waiting for a reaction, an argument, a challenge, something he could engage with, but Melanie offered nothing. No escalation, no retreat, just presence. And that more than anything unsettled him, because control required movement, and she was no longer moving. The next morning, the shift became visible. Roman's phone rang earlier than usual. He answered it this time without stepping outside. "Yes, sir," he said, his tone immediately more formal. Melanie, standing in the kitchen, did not turn around, but she listened. A pause, then another. "I understand," Roman said. His voice had changed, not in volume, but in weight. He ended the call slowly, set the phone down. For the first time since returning home, his movements were not entirely smooth. Melanie turned, then meeting his gaze. "What is it?" she asked. Roman hesitated. Just briefly. Nothing, he said. But the word lacked its usual certainty. Melanie nodded. Of course, nothing. She turned back to the counter, continuing what she had been doing. Behind her, Roman stood still for a moment longer, then moved again, but not with the same precision, because something had already begun. Not loudly, not publicly, but officially. And for the first time, Roman Carter was no longer the one controlling the narrative. Money had never been a subject Melanie approached emotionally. It had always been structural, organized, accounted for. Long before the hospital night, she had maintained a quiet system that ensured stability, rent paid on time. Utilities tracked grocery budgets, adjusted small savings set aside, even when there was little to spare. It wasn't about control in the way Roman understood it. It was about continuity. Things that kept a household from slipping. After Ivy was born, that structure became tighter, more deliberate. Medical costs alone required attention appointments, prescriptions, follow-ups. Nothing excessive, but enough that every transaction carried weight. Melanie did not check their accounts daily. She checked them when something felt misaligned. The first time it happened, she almost missed it. A restaurant charge. $87. Not unusual on its own. But Roman had told her he was on base that evening, working late. She noticed the discrepancy, paused, then let it go, because one inconsistency did not yet require action. The second appeared a week later. A retail purchase, $142. A boutique she did not recognize. Roman had not mentioned buying anything. Again she noted it, quietly. Still she said nothing. Patterns require repetition. By the time Ivy's fever spiked, Melanie had already begun to sense that the financial record held something more precise than memory could. The morning after returning from the hospital, while Ivy slept in brief, fragile intervals, Melanie opened the banking app on her phone. Not impulsively, methodically. She scrolled through recent transactions, then further back. A week, 2, a month. The pattern did not reveal itself immediately. It rarely did. Instead, it appeared in fragments. Restaurant, gas station, retail. Then something different. A hotel charge. $212. Melanie's thumb paused on the screen. She did not react outwardly. She did not close the app. She simply noted the date. Cross-referenced it mentally. That night, Roman had said he was working late. Very late. He had come home after midnight. Tired, quiet. She continued scrolling. Another withdrawal, cash, $100. Then another, $50. No explanation attached. Cash rarely carried explanation. That was its function. Melanie set her phone down for a moment. Looked at Ivy. The baby's breathing was steady now, though still monitored closely. A small improvement. A necessary one. Melanie reached for the notebook, opened it, flipped to a new page. At the top she wrote, "Financial timeline." No emotion in the title, just structure. She began listing entries, dates, amounts, descriptions as they appeared on the statement. She did not interpret. She did not assume. She recorded, Once the initial list was complete, she stood and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, opened the laptop, logged into the full account portal. The larger screen allowed for more detail, more clarity. She downloaded the statements, saved them, organized by month. Then she printed them, one by one. The sound of the printer was soft but consistent, paper sliding out in clean, quiet sheets. Melanie stacked them neatly, aligned the edges, sat down again. This time, she compared. Statement against memory, statement against notes, statement against what Roman had said. Oh, and more importantly, what he had not said. The pattern sharpened. Not chaotic, structured, predictable. Charges clustered around certain days. Gaps that aligned with his absences. Spending that increased while household expenses remained delayed. She noticed something else. A payment that had not been made. The pediatric follow-up bill from 2 weeks prior. Still pending. Melanie knew it was due. She had set a reminder. Roman had said he would handle it. He hadn't. Instead, on that same day, there was a restaurant charge. $93. Melanie did not react. She circled the date, marked it, moved on. By the time Roman returned home that evening, the documents were already organized. Not displayed, not hidden. Simply placed in a folder on the desk. Roman entered the house with the same measured rhythm. Keys down, shoes aligned, jacket hung. "How is she?" he asked, nodding toward Ivy. "Stable," Melanie said. Roman nodded. "Good." He moved toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. Routine, predictable. Melanie watched him briefly, then returned her attention to the papers. Roman noticed, eventually. "What are you working on?" he asked, leaning slightly against the doorway. Melanie did not look up immediately, just reviewing some things she said. "What kind of things? Accounts?" Roman's posture shifted, subtly. Why, Melanie lifted one of the pages, looked at it, then set it back down. "Because they don't match," she said. Roman stepped closer. Match what? Melanie turned, then meeting his gaze directly. "What we have," she said. "And what's being spent." Silence followed. Roman's expression remained controlled, but there was a delay now, a fraction of a second longer than before. "That's normal," he said. "Expenses fluctuate." Melanie nodded. "They do?" She reached for one of the printed pages, held it out. Roman took it, glanced over it quickly, then more carefully. "It's just," he began, then stopped, adjusted. "Work-related stuff. Meals, travel." Melanie watched him. "Which part?" she asked. Roman looked up. "All of it," he said. Melanie tilted her head slightly. "The hotel?" she asked. Roman's grip on the paper tightened. "Training," he said. "Overnight." Melanie nodded once. "Which training?" Roman hesitated. "Just enough." "It was last minute," he said. Melanie did not respond immediately. She reached for another page, placed it beside the first. "And this?" she asked. Roman followed her gaze. "Retail purchase." He exhaled. "A gift," he said. "For who?" Melanie asked. The question was direct, not aggressive. Roman's eyes flicked up, then back down. "It doesn't matter," he said. Melanie held his gaze. "It does," she replied. Another pause. Roman set the papers down. "You're reading too much into this," he said. Melanie did not raise her voice. "I'm reading what's there." Roman stepped back slightly, as if creating space. "This isn't productive," he said. Melanie nodded. "You're right." She gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, placed them back in the folder. Roman watched her, waiting for escalation, for emotion, for something he could manage. But Melanie offered none. Instead, she stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a small glass of water, took a sip, then spoke. "I've opened a separate account," she said. Roman turned sharply. What? Melanie set the glass down. "For Ivy," she continued. "Medical expenses, essentials." Roman stared at her. "You didn't talk to me about that." Melanie met his gaze. "I'm informing you now." The shift was subtle, but absolute. Roman's authority, once assumed, no longer applied in the same way. "You can't just," he began. "I can," Melanie said. Not loudly, not forcefully, just clearly. Roman stopped, the sentence unfinished, because for the first time, he did not have immediate control over the outcome. Melanie picked up the folder, carried it to the desk, placed it inside a drawer, closed it. The sound was soft, but final. Behind her, Roman stood still, processing, recalculating, because something had changed. Not in words, not in tone, but in structure. And structure, once altered, did not return to its original form easily. Melanie returned to Ivy's side, adjusted the blanket, rested her hand lightly near the baby's arm. The house remained quiet. But it was no longer neutral. It had become something else, a place where facts were no longer shared casually, but stored, organized, and prepared. The first time Roman Carter was asked to explain himself, it was done quietly. No formal summons, no written notice, just a message delivered through the proper channel. Captain Hayes would like to see you. It happened mid-morning inside a building Roman had entered hundreds of times without hesitation. The structure itself did not change. The hallway remained the same length. The doors the same shade of government-issued neutrality. But perception shifted. Roman adjusted his uniform before knocking. Clean lines, correct posture. Presentation had always been his advantage. Enter. Captain Daniel Hayes sat behind his desk, a file open in front of him. He did not look up immediately. That in itself was a signal. Roman stepped inside. Staff Sergeant Carter reporting, sir. Hayes nodded once, then lifted his gaze. At ease. Roman complied, measured, controlled. Hayes studied him for a moment, not with suspicion, but with assessment. Then he closed the file. I received a call early this morning, Hayes said. Roman's expression remained unchanged. Yes, sir. Hayes leaned back slightly. It concerned your whereabouts last night. Roman nodded once. Yes, sir. No elaboration. Hayes waited. Silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Finally, Roman spoke. I had to step away briefly, he said. Personal matter. Hayes did not interrupt. Family was at the hospital, Roman added. I handled what I needed to and returned later. The explanation was structured, contained, but incomplete. Hayes tapped a finger lightly against the desk. Your daughter was admitted to the ER with a high fever, he said. Roman's jaw tightened slightly. Yes, sir. And you left during intake, Hayes continued. Roman held his posture. Yes, sir. Hayes's gaze did not waver. For how long? Roman paused, calculating. Approximately an hour, he said. Hayes nodded slowly. Your wife reported that you did not return. Another pause. Roman adjusted his stance. I had a situation that required immediate attention, he said. I intended to go back. Hayes did not challenge the statement directly. Instead, he reached for the file. Opened it again. There are a few things we need to clarify, he said. Roman remained still. Yes, sir. Hayes flipped a page. Your duty log shows you were off at the time, he said. So this isn't about unauthorized absence. Roman's shoulders remained square. Understood, sir. But Hayes continued, when a service member's conduct intersects with family welfare, in a way that raises concern, it becomes relevant. Roman did not respond. Hayes closed the file again. This is informal, he said. For now. The words carried weight. For now. Roman inclined his head slightly. Yes, sir. Hayes studied him again. You've had a solid record up to this point, he said. Consistent performance. No prior issues. Roman nodded. Yes, sir. Hayes leaned forward slightly. So, help me understand, he said. Why your wife felt it necessary to contact me directly. Roman's answer came quickly. She was under stress, he said. Our daughter was sick. Emotions were high. Hayes did not react immediately. Instead, he let the statement sit. Then he asked, was her report inaccurate? Roman hesitated. A fraction too long. No, sir, he said finally, but it lacked context. Hayes's expression remained neutral. What context would that be? Roman shifted his weight. I had to address a personal matter, he repeated. He couldn't wait. Hayes nodded slowly. And that matter took priority over your presence at the hospital. Roman held his gaze. It was time-sensitive, he said. Hayes leaned back again. The chair creaked softly. All right, he said. We'll leave it there for now. Roman's posture remained unchanged. Yes, sir. Hayes closed the file completely this time. You're dismissed. Roman turned, walked out. The door closed behind him with the same controlled quiet it always had. But outside, the hallway felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because something had been introduced. A question. And questions once documented did not disappear. Back at home, Melanie Carter continued her routine with the same quiet precision. Ivy's condition had stabilized further. The fever had broken, though not completely. There were follow-up instructions, medication schedules, monitoring. Melanie followed each one carefully. She did not check her phone often. But when she did, there was a message waiting. Unknown number. Short, Mrs. Carter, this is Captain Hayes. I'd like to speak with you when convenient. Melanie read it once, then again. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she finished preparing Ivy's bottle, fed her, waited until the baby settled. Only then did she reply. Available now. The call came within minutes. Mrs. Carter, Hayes said. Thank you for taking the time. Melanie's voice remained steady. Of course. Hayes did not waste time. I wanted to follow up on your call, he said, and ask if you're willing to provide any additional information. Melanie considered her response. I can provide what I have, she said. Hayes paused. What does that include? Timeline, Melanie said. Records, observations, no emotion, no accusation, just structure. Hayes exhaled quietly. That would be helpful, he said. Melanie nodded, though he could not see it. I'll send what's relevant, she said. Thank you, Hayes replied. We'll handle this appropriately. Melanie ended the call, set the phone down. There was no visible reaction, no relief, no tension, just continuation. She stood, walked to the desk, opened the drawer, removed the folder. Inside, the documents remained exactly as she had left them, aligned, organized, ready. She added a new page. At the top, she wrote, Submission Initial, then began listing. Dates, events, supporting records. She did not include speculation, only what could be verified. The hospital visit, the absence, the call logs, the financial discrepancies briefly noted, not expanded. Enough to establish pattern, not enough to overreach. She worked steadily, line by line. Outside, the afternoon light shifted slowly across the floor. Time moved, but without urgency, because Melanie was no longer reacting. She was documenting. That evening, Roman returned home later than usual. He entered with the same controlled movements, but there was something different now, not visible to anyone else, but present. Melanie noticed it immediately. A slight delay before he spoke. The way his eyes moved, not scanning, but checking. How's she? He asked. Better, Melanie said. Roman nodded. Good, he paused, then added, I had a meeting today. Melanie looked at him. I know, she said. Roman's expression tightened. How Melanie held his gaze. They called me, she said. Silence followed. Longer this time. Roman exhaled slowly. What did you tell them? The question was direct, stripped of its usual framing. Melanie answered just as directly. The truth. Roman's jaw set. You're escalating this, he said. Melanie shook her head slightly. I'm recording it. The distinction mattered. Roman knew it. That was the problem, because escalation could be managed. It could be argued, contained. But a record did not respond. It did not adjust. It simply existed. Roman looked away briefly, then back. This isn't necessary, he said. Melanie did not respond. She did not need to, because necessity was no longer determined by him. The room settled into silence again. But this time, it carried weight. Not emotional, structural. Something had shifted beyond conversation, beyond explanation, into process. And process once initiated did not reverse easily. Roman stood there for a moment longer, then turned. moved toward the kitchen, routine again, but altered. Because for the first time, the system he had relied on control through perception was no longer the only structure in place. There was another now, quieter, more precise, and already in motion. Melanie returned to the desk, opened the folder, reviewed what she had written, then added one final line. Call to commanding officer, 3:12 a.m. She closed the folder, placed it back in the drawer. And this time, when she shut it, the sound carried something more than closure. It carried intent. The house did not grow louder as tension increased. It grew quieter. Not in the way silence brings peace, but in the way it removes distraction. Every movement became more noticeable. Every pause more defined. Roman Carter adjusted quickly. He always did. Adaptation had been one of his strengths, refining behavior based on environment, recalibrating tone, depending on what was required. But this situation was different, because it was not built on reaction. It was built on record, and records did not respond to charm. They accumulated. The first change came in his phone. Passwords updated, notifications minimized, screen time shortened. He no longer left it unattended, not even briefly. Where it had once rested casually on counters or tables, it now remained within reach. Always. Melanie noticed. Of course she did. But she did not comment. She did not ask for access. She did not need to, because access had already served its purpose. Now it was about preservation. That same evening, Roman altered his tone. Softer, more attentive. Not dramatically, but enough to register. You've been handling a lot, he said, standing near the kitchen as Melanie prepared Ivy's medication. I'm managing, she replied. Roman nodded. You don't have to do everything on your own. The words sounded supportive, but there was a structure beneath them, an invitation to shift responsibility, to create shared space. Melanie measured the offer, then declined it not outwardly, but through continuation. I have it covered, she said. Roman watched her for a moment, and then stepped closer. I can help with the schedule, he added, or take over tonight if you need rest. Melanie shook her head slightly. I've already organized it. She handed him the printed chart. Feeding times, medication intervals, temperature checks. Roman glanced at it. Everything was precise. Everything accounted for. There was no gap for him to fill. Right, he said. He set the paper down. The offer dissolved. Not rejected, but rendered unnecessary. Later, Roman tried a different approach. Not assistance, reframing. You've been under a lot of stress, he said that night, his voice low measured as they stood in separate parts of the living room. Melanie did not look up from the notebook. I have, she said. Roman nodded. That can affect how things are perceived. The sentence was subtle, carefully constructed. Melanie paused, not because she was considering it, but because she recognized it. This was familiar, not the exact wording, but the structure. A suggestion that reality might be distorted by emotion. That interpretation, not action, was the issue. Melanie lifted her eyes. Met his gaze. I'm not confused, she said. Roman held her stare. I didn't say you were. You implied it. A brief silence followed. Roman exhaled. I'm saying we should keep things in perspective, he said. Melanie closed the notebook, placed it on the table. The perspective is written down, she replied. The statement was simple, but definitive. Roman's jaw tightened slightly, because this was not an argument. It was a boundary. Over the next few days, the house settled into a new rhythm. Not cooperative, not hostile, but structured. Roman reduced his absences, not completely, but noticeably. He came home earlier, stayed in shared spaces longer, spoke more frequently. Each adjustment was measured, intentional. Melanie observed all of it, without comment, without reaction, because she understood the pattern: correction in response to pressure, temporary alignment, designed to stabilize perception. She did not interrupt it, but she did not rely on it either. Instead, she continued her work. Documents were scanned, saved digitally, backed up. She created folders, labeled them clearly. Medical financial communication. Each file was placed with precision, each date confirmed, each entry cross-referenced. She did not rush. There was no urgency in her movements, only consistency. One afternoon, while Roman was in the next room, his phone rang. It was on the kitchen counter. For a moment, just a moment, it was unattended. Melanie did not move immediately. She looked at the screen. A name. Rachel, no last name, no label, just enough. The phone continued to ring. 5 seconds, 6, 7. Melanie reached out, not to answer, just to observe. The screen dimmed. The call ended. A notification appeared. Missed call. Rachel. Melanie did not touch the phone again. She returned to the table, opened the notebook, wrote incoming call, Rachel, 2:14 p.m. No interpretation, no assumption, just record. Moments later, Roman entered the kitchen. His eyes went immediately to the phone. A flicker of something quick contained. Did it ring? He asked. Melanie nodded. Yes. Who was it? Melanie met his gaze. It said Rachel. Roman's expression remained steady, but the pause returned. That's someone from work, he said. Melanie nodded once. Okay, no challenge, no follow-up. Roman picked up the phone, checked it, then set it back down. But not in the same place. Closer to him now, always closer. That evening, the dynamic shifted again. Roman sat across from Melanie, his posture slightly forward. Intentional. I think we should talk about what's going on, he said. Melanie looked at him. All right. Roman took a breath. You've been documenting things, he said. Yes. Why the question carried weight now? Not casual, not curious. Melanie answered without hesitation. Because memory changes, she said. Records don't. Roman leaned back slightly. That sounds like you're preparing for something. Melanie held his gaze. I am. Silence followed. Roman studied her. What exactly do you think is happening? He asked. Melanie did not list accusations. She did not describe patterns. She simply said, I think what's happening is already documented. Roman exhaled slowly. This isn't how people handle things, he said. Melanie tilted her head slightly. It is now. The statement landed quietly, but it carried finality. Roman looked away briefly, then back. This is going to create problems, he said. Melanie nodded. Yes, for both of us. Melanie's expression did not change, not equally. Another silence, longer this time. Roman did not respond, because he understood, at least partially, that the balance had shifted. That night, as the house settled again into its new, quieter structure, Melanie sat at the desk with her laptop open. A new file, blank. She titled it Summary Preliminary. Then began typing. Not everything, not yet. Just enough to organize. Timeline, key events, supporting documents. She worked steadily, line by line. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the only sound was the soft rhythm of Ivy's breathing through the monitor. And the quiet, consistent tapping of keys. Roman moved through the house behind her. Slower now, more aware. Because something he had once controlled effortlessly, perception, was no longer his alone. There was another system in place, one that did not rely on tone or timing or explanation, only on what had already happened and what had been preserved. Melanie saved the document, backed it up, closed the laptop. She did not look toward Roman. She did not need to, because this was no longer about what he might say next. It was about what had already been written and what would follow, without noise, without spectacle, just progression. The audio did not arrive in a dramatic way, nor did it announce itself as something that would alter the direction of everything that followed. It came instead through a sequence of small, ordinary circumstances, exactly the kind that often go unnoticed until they are reviewed later with greater clarity. 2 days after the missed call labeled Rachel, Roman left his phone on the kitchen counter again, though only briefly. It was not negligence, but interruption. A knock at the door, unexpected, requiring immediate attention. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with the same controlled motion he always used, but this time. For once, he did not take the phone with him. Melanie was seated at the table, reviewing Ivy's medication schedule while the baby slept in the bassinet nearby. She did not move immediately when the phone buzzed. Her first instinct by now was not curiosity, but assessment. She had already gathered enough to understand the structure of what Roman was managing. Additional fragments were no longer about discovery. They were about confirmation. The screen lit up with a notification, not a call this time, but a voicemail. Unknown number. The transcription preview displayed only a few words, fragmented and imprecise. You said she wouldn't. Hospital. This is too much. Melanie's eyes remained on the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Then, with a controlled motion that mirrored the same restraint she had applied to everything else, she reached out and tapped the notification. The audio began. It was not loud. The volume was low, almost insufficient, as if the recording had been captured unintentionally. There was background noise movement, a door closing distant traffic, but beneath it Roman's voice was unmistakable. I told you, it's not what it looks like. A pause. Then more clearly, I can't keep dropping everything every time something happens over there. Melanie did not move. The words settled into the space around her, not as shock, but as alignment. Another voice followed, female, tense, controlled. That's your child, Roman. A longer pause. Roman exhaled, the sound faint but audible. I know, he said, but it's always something. It's constant. I can't. He stopped, then corrected himself. I just need this to stay separate. Separate. The word carried more weight than volume. The recording continued. I said I'd handle it, Roman added, his tone flattening. You don't need to worry about that side of things. That side of things. Melanie listened until the audio ended. There was no dramatic conclusion, no raised voices, no final declaration, just the quiet termination of the message. She did not replay it immediately. Instead, she placed the phone back exactly where it had been. Then she sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the surface of the wood. For several seconds, nothing moved. Not externally. Internally, however, something had shifted from assumption into certainty, not emotional certainty, which fluctuates, but structural certainty, which does not require reinforcement once established. The distinction mattered. Because until this moment, everything she had gathered, messages, timelines, financial inconsistencies, had formed a pattern that could still be reframed, minimized, or explained away by someone skilled enough in controlling narrative. This could not. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear, because it was recorded, because it existed outside interpretation. Melanie reached for her notebook, opened it, wrote, voicemail Roman / female voice, likely Rachel, content, prioritization, conflict, acknowledgement of separation of responsibilities. She paused, then added, key phrase, I can't keep dropping everything, no adjectives, no judgment, just record. When Roman returned to the kitchen, his movements slowed slightly as he approached the counter. His eyes moved to the phone first, then to Melanie. Did I miss anything, he asked. The question was neutral, practiced. Melanie met his gaze. There was a voicemail, she said. Roman's hand hovered just above the phone. From who, unknown number? He picked it up, checked the screen. For a moment, just a moment, his expression shifted. Not visibly enough for someone unfamiliar with him to notice. But Melanie had spent enough time observing to recognize the difference between control and effort. He recovered quickly. Probably nothing important, he said. Melanie nodded. Maybe. She did not mention the content. She did not reference the words. She did not need to. Because what mattered was not whether he acknowledged it. What mattered was that it existed. Roman placed the phone in his pocket this time, rather than leaving it on the counter. Another adjustment. Another small recalibration. The pattern continued. That evening, Roman spoke more than usual. He asked about Ivy's condition, followed up on medication schedules, offered to take over for a few hours, each action aligned with attentiveness, each word carefully placed. Melanie responded appropriately, calmly, without resistance, without encouragement, because the performance no longer required evaluation, only observation. Later that night, after Ivy had settled into a deeper sleep and the house had returned to its familiar quiet, Melanie sat at the desk with her laptop open. The folder labeled Communication was already organized. She created a new subfolder, Audio. Then, using the access she still had before Roman changed everything permanently, she transferred the voicemail file, saved it, renamed it with date and time, backed it up twice. She did not listen to it again immediately. Instead, she opened the document titled Summary Preliminary and began to integrate the new information, not as a reaction, but as a continuation. She wrote audio evidence indicates explicit prioritization of external relationship over family emergency response. Language confirms intentional separation of responsibilities. She paused, considered, then adjusted the wording slightly, removed anything that could be interpreted as emotional, replaced it with precision. Because this document was no longer for her. It was for process, and process required clarity above all else. Across the room, Roman moved quietly, and there was movements now carried a subtle tension that had not been present before. He watched her occasionally, not directly, but through peripheral glances, checking, assessing, attempting to understand what had already moved beyond his control. He did not ask what she was doing, not this time, because he already knew the answer would not give him what he needed. Melanie continued typing, each sentence deliberate, each entry aligned with evidence. The structure of the case, though she did not yet call it that, was forming. Not quickly, but completely. Outside, the night stretched on uninterrupted. Inside, the balance continued to shift not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Roman had relied on the idea that what was not spoken could be managed, that what was not seen could be denied, that what was not recorded could be reshaped. But now, there was something he could not adjust, something that did not respond to tone, or timing, or explanation, something that simply existed. Melanie saved the document again, closed the laptop. And for the first time since the hospital night, she allowed herself to lean back slightly in the chair, not in relief, but in recognition. The uncertainty was gone. What remained was process, and process once established on verified ground did not require belief, only continuation. The decision to seek legal counsel did not arrive as a moment of crisis. It arrived as a continuation. By the time Melanie Carter scheduled the appointment, the emotional questions had already been resolved internally. What remained were structural considerations, custody, financial stability, documentation, and the boundaries that would need to be established, not through conversation, but through enforceable process. She chose Laura Mitchell carefully, not through recommendation alone, though there had been one quietly offered by another military spouse months earlier in an unrelated conversation. Melanie selected her based on pattern cases, handled outcomes, documented professional tone, and an absence of performative language in public statements. Laura Mitchell did not advertise aggressively. She did not need to. Her work spoke in outcomes, not promises. The office was located in a modest building just outside the main commercial district, far enough from the base to avoid unnecessary attention, but close enough to remain accessible. Inside, the environment reflected the same philosophy Melanie had come to value: order, clarity, and restraint. No excess, no distraction. Laura greeted her without ceremony. "Mrs. Carter," she said, extending a hand. "Melanie is fine," Melanie replied. Laura nodded once, acknowledging the preference. They sat across from each other at a wide desk, its surface clear except for a notepad and a pen. "Tell me what you're dealing with," Laura said. The question was open, but it did not invite emotion. It invited structure. Melanie began. She did not start with the hospital. She did not start with the affair. She started with timeline. Over the past 3 months, she said there have been consistent discrepancies between stated activities and verifiable records. Laura's pen moved immediately. Go on. Melanie continued outlining events in sequence: absences, financial inconsistencies, communication gaps, and finally, the hospital night. She did not embellish, she did not interpret, she presented. When she finished, Laura did not respond immediately. She reviewed her notes, then looked up. Do you have documentation for these points? She asked. Yes, Melanie said. She placed the folder on the desk. Not all of it, just the initial set. Laura opened it, reviewed the contents, bank statements, printed logs, a structured timeline. Her expression did not change, but her pace slowed slightly, which to Melanie indicated attention. This is thorough, Laura said. Melanie nodded. I've been consistent. Laura closed the folder. That matters, she said. A lot. She leaned back slightly, considering. Let's break this into categories, she continued. Custody, financials, and conduct. Melanie listened. First, custody, Laura said. Your daughter's medical condition strengthens your position for primary custody, especially if there's documented absence during a medical emergency. Melanie did not react. She noted the statement. Second, financials, Laura went on. If marital funds are being used in a way that does not support the household, particularly while medical expenses are pending, that becomes relevant. Melanie nodded once. Third, conduct, Laura said. The relationship itself is not always the primary issue legally, but if it intersects with neglect, dishonesty, or financial misuse, it becomes part of a larger pattern. She paused. Do you have anything that directly connects these elements? She asked. Melanie reached into her bag, removed a flash drive, placed it on the desk. There's an audio file, she said. Laura looked at it. Recorded legally, she asked. Yes, Melanie replied. It was left as a voicemail. Laura nodded. Good. She did not listen to it immediately. Instead, she made a note. We'll review that carefully, she said. She folded her hands. What I'm seeing here, she continued, is not a situation that requires escalation through confrontation. It requires preservation. Melanie understood. I haven't confronted him, she said. Laura nodded. That's clear. She leaned forward slightly. From this point on, everything matters, she said. Every message, every transaction, every interaction. Not emotionally, but legally. Melanie met her gaze. I'm prepared for that. Laura studied her for a moment, then nodded once. I can see that. She reached for a blank document. Here's what we're going to do, she said. We'll begin by organizing your evidence into a formal structure. Chronological. Verifiable, clean. Melanie listened. No speculation, Laura added. No interpretation, just facts. That's already how I've been documenting, Melanie said. Laura allowed a slight shift in expression, something close to approval. Good, she said. That will make this significantly easier. She continued outlining the process, filing options, temporary custody considerations, financial disclosures, the role of military oversight in parallel with civilian legal proceedings. Each point was delivered with clarity, no exaggeration, no false reassurance. Melanie absorbed it all, not as information, but as framework. Because this was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about structuring what would happen next. At the end of the meeting, Laura closed the folder. We'll move forward, she said. But we do it carefully. Melanie nodded. Of course. Laura paused, then added one more thing. Melanie waited. Do not engage in arguments, Laura said. Do not attempt to force admissions. Let the documentation speak. Melanie's response was immediate. I already am. Laura nodded. I know. When Melanie returned home, the house was quiet. Roman was there, seated in the living room, waiting. He looked up as she entered. Where were you? He asked. The question was direct, not aggressive, but no longer casual. Melanie set her bag down. Out, she said. Roman's gaze held. For what? Melanie met his eyes. I had an appointment. With who? A pause, measured. Then legal counsel. The words settled into the room without force, but their impact was immediate. Roman stood, slowly. "You're serious," he said. Melanie did not respond to the tone. "I'm proceeding," she said. Roman exhaled sharply. "This is getting out of control." Melanie shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "It's being organized." Roman ran a hand through his hair, a rare break in composure. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be." Melanie held his gaze. "It already is." Silence followed. Roman stepped closer. "What do you want?" he asked. The question carried more than frustration. It carried uncertainty. Melanie answered without hesitation. "Clarity," she said. Roman stared at her. "And you think this is how you get it?" Melanie nodded. "Yes." Another pause. Longer. He looked at her as if trying to recalibrate, searching for the version of her that had once responded differently. But that version was no longer present, because Melanie was no longer responding. She was proceeding. Roman's shoulders lowered slightly, not in surrender, but in recognition. Because for the first time, he was not negotiating perception. He was facing structure, and structure did not shift based on tone. Melanie turned, walked toward Ivy's bassinet, adjusted the blanket, checked her temperature. Routine, stable, necessary. Behind her, Roman remained standing. Still. Because the system he had relied on control through explanation had been replaced by something quieter, more precise, and already in motion. That night, Melanie opened her laptop again, created a new folder, Legal. Inside it, she began organizing everything she had gathered. Not differently, just more formally. Because now there was a direction, and direction once defined did not require urgency, only continuation. Rachel Bennett did not realize the truth all at once. It did not arrive as a single revelation, nor did it confront her in a way that demanded immediate acknowledgement. Instead, it unfolded slowly in fragments that resisted alignment until they no longer could. At first, it was timing. Roman's responses, once consistent and deliberate, began to shift in ways that felt less controlled. Messages that had previously arrived within minutes were now delayed. Calls were shorter. Plans became uncertain. He explained each change. Of course he did. Work's been intense. Things are complicated right now. I'm trying to sort some things out. Each explanation carried enough plausibility to delay concern. But delay was not resolution. Rachel had learned through experience that inconsistency often revealed more than absence. It was not the gaps themselves that mattered. It was how they changed over time. One evening, after a message from Roman went unanswered for several hours, Rachel sat at her kitchen table with her phone in front of her, reviewing their conversation history. Not emotionally, not searching for reassurance, but examining the pattern. Dates, times, tone. She noticed something she had previously overlooked. Clusters. Periods of intense communication followed by abrupt distance. Not random. Structured. Aligned with something she could not yet see. She scrolled further back. Weeks, months. The pattern held. It was not chaotic. It was scheduled. That realization did not produce immediate anger. It produced something quieter. Doubt. Not of him alone, but of the version of events she had accepted. Rachel set the phone down, then picked it up again. Opened a different thread. A number she did not often use. A friend who worked near the base. She typed a message. Simple. Do you know a Staff Sergeant Roman Carter? The response came faster than expected. Yeah. Why? Rachel paused, considered. Then typed, is he married? There was a delay this time. Longer. Then, yes. Has a wife. And a baby, I think. Rachel read the message once. Then again. The words did not change, but their meaning expanded. A wife. A baby. Not a distant, dissolving marriage. Not a structure already broken. Something active. Something present. She set the phone down. Her hand remained there, resting lightly against the surface of the table. Her breathing remained steady. But internally, something had shifted, not into panic, not into confrontation, but into re-evaluation. Every conversation she had had with Roman rearranged itself. Every explanation, every omission, not as isolated events, but as parts of a constructed narrative. She picked up the phone again, scrolled to his contact, paused, then called. The line rang, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, he answered. "Hey," Roman said, his tone familiar, controlled. Rachel did not match it. "I need to ask you something," she said. A pause. "Okay. Are you still living with your wife?" Roman did not respond immediately. "Then, it's complicated." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes," he said finally. The word landed with clarity. Rachel nodded, once though he could not see it. "And your child?" she asked. Roman exhaled. "She's been sick," he said. "It's been a lot." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "You told me it was basically over," she said. "It is," Roman replied quickly. "Emotionally, it's been over for a while." Rachel opened her eyes, looked straight ahead. "That's not the same thing," she said. Silence. Roman shifted. "You don't understand the situation," he said. Rachel's voice remained steady. "No," she said. "I understand exactly what you chose not to tell me." Another silence. Longer, more defined. Roman's tone changed slightly. Not softer, more controlled. "I was trying to handle things the right way," he said. Rachel let the words sit, then asked, "By leaving a hospital while your child was there?" The question landed directly. Roman did not respond immediately. "How do you know about that?" he asked. Rachel did not answer, because the source was irrelevant. The fact was not. "That's not the point," she said. Roman exhaled again. "You're getting one side of this," he said. Rachel's expression did not change. "I'm getting enough." Another pause. Roman adjusted. "You're reacting based on incomplete information." Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair. "No," she said. "I'm reacting to what you've confirmed." The distinction mattered. Roman knew it. That was why he did not immediately respond. Rachel continued. "You didn't just leave things out," she said. "You structured it so I wouldn't ask." Roman's voice tightened. "That's not fair." Rachel almost smiled, not out of humor, out of recognition. "Fair isn't the issue," she said. Silence again. Roman shifted tone once more. More measured, more careful. "I didn't want to bring you into something messy," he said. Rachel's gaze remained steady. "You already did," she replied. There was nothing dramatic in her voice. No accusation, no escalation. Just clarity. And clarity, once established, did not require reinforcement. Roman attempted one final adjustment. "This doesn't have to change anything," he said. Rachel's response came immediately. "It already has." The conversation ended shortly after. Not with argument, not with resolution, just termination. Rachel set the phone down. This time, she did not pick it up again. She sat there for a long moment, allowing the information to settle, not emotionally, but structurally. Because what she had been part of was no longer ambiguous. It was defined, not by what she had been told, but by what had been withheld. Across town, in a house that had grown increasingly quiet, Melanie Carter continued her work. She did not know the details of Rachel's realization. She did not need to, because her process did not depend on external confirmation, only on internal consistency. She sat at the desk, reviewing the updated timeline. The audio file was now integrated, the financial records aligned, the communication logs complete. Each element supported the others. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. She added a new section. Third-party awareness, potential. Not as assumption, but as preparation. Because once information began to surface beyond its original structure, it tended to expand. Melanie understood that. She did not anticipate Rachel's actions. She did not rely on them. But she accounted for the possibility. Because structure required foresight, not prediction. She closed the document, saved it, backed it up. Across the room, Roman stood near the window, his phone in his hand. He had been quieter that evening, less controlled, more aware, because something else had shifted, not within the house, but outside it. Another variable, Another loss of control. Melanie did not look at him. She did not need to, because the process was no longer dependent on what he did next, only on what had already been established. And what would follow? Without noise, without urgency, just progression. Rachel, in her own space, reached a similar conclusion. Not connected to Melanie, not coordinated, but parallel, because truth, once fragmented, tends to reassemble itself, even across distance, even without intention. And when it does not ask for permission. It simply becomes visible. The email was not written in a moment of anger, nor was it shaped by urgency or the need to respond to something immediate. It was constructed over time, in stages, each section carefully considered, revised, and aligned with the documentation that had already been gathered. By the time Melanie Carter opened her laptop that morning, the content itself was no longer uncertain. What remained was the arrangement. She sat at the desk in the same position she had used for days, her posture steady, her movements deliberate. Ivy was asleep in the bassinet nearby, her breathing more stable now, though still monitored with the same quiet attention that had defined Melanie's routine since the hospital. The house, as it had been for some time, carried a silence that was no longer temporary. It had become structural, a space in which decisions were made without interruption. Melanie opened a new document. She did not begin immediately. Instead, she reviewed what had already been prepared, the timeline. The financial records, the communication logs, the audio file that had shifted everything from pattern into confirmation. Each element had been placed with care, labeled dated and cross-referenced. There were no gaps that required speculation. There were no conclusions that extended beyond what could be supported. Only after confirming that everything aligned did she begin to write. The subject line was simple. Subject, documentation, submission. Carter case, preliminary. No emphasis. No suggestion of urgency. Just identification. She addressed it to Laura Mitchell with a secondary inclusion to a secure channel that had been provided for formal documentation review. There was no attempt to dramatize the situation or through language. The email was not meant to persuade. It was meant to present. The opening paragraph established context. This email provides a structured summary of documented events, financial records, and communication logs relevant to the current legal consultation regarding marital conduct, financial discrepancies, and custodial considerations. She paused briefly, reading the sentence again, ensuring that it carried no unnecessary weight. Then she continued. The body of the email was divided into sections. 1. Timeline of events. Melanie outlined the sequence with precision, beginning not with the hospital, but with the earliest identifiable discrepancies. Dates were listed clearly. Each entry included a short factual description and a reference to supporting documentation attached below. She did not describe behavior as neglect. She described absence. She did not describe dishonesty. She described inconsistency between statements and verifiable records. The hospital night appeared midway through the section. Date, insert date. Event, infant Ivy Carter, admitted to ER with high fever. Observation. Roman Carter departed during intake process and did not return within the observed period, approx. 4+ hours. Supporting call log medical intake timestamp. There was no elaboration, no interpretation. The weight of the event remained intact because it was not expanded. 2. Financial records. This section was more detailed, though still restrained. Melanie listed transactions chronologically, identifying those that did not align with household expenses or previously stated obligations. Each entry included the date amount and description as it appeared on the statement. She did not label any purchase as inappropriate. She simply noted its inconsistency with declared activity. A separate subsection addressed the delay in medical bill payment. Pediatric follow-up invoice date insert remains unpaid as of current date, despite available funds being allocated to non-household expenditures within the same time frame. The statement was neutral, but precise. 3. Communication log here. Melanie summarized patterns rather than individual messages. She included timestamps of calls, durations, and instances of unavailability that aligned with documented absences. One entry referenced the missed call labeled Rachel. Date, insert event, incoming call, contact name. Rachel observed. Duration, unanswered. Context occurred during period of reported availability. Again, no conclusion, only placement. 4. Audio evidence. This section was brief. Attached voicemail file, date, insert. Content, conversation, indicating prioritization. Conflict between family medical situation and external relationship. Notable language includes reference to not being able to drop everything, an intent to keep things separate. Melanie did not expand further. The file itself would carry the necessary weight. After completing the sections, she added a closing statement. All information provided above is supported by attached documentation and has been recorded without interpretation or alteration. Additional materials are available upon request. She reviewed the entire document once more. Then again, not for grammar, for alignment, for tone, for absence of excess. Only when she was certain that nothing within the email could be challenged as subjective did she proceed to attach the files. Each document was labeled clearly. Each file name matched the references in the body. There were no inconsistencies, no ambiguity. When she finished, her hand rested on the trackpad for a moment longer than necessary. Not out of hesitation, but recognition. Because once sent, the email would no longer be part of her internal process. It would enter another system, one that operated independently. She clicked send. The message left her screen without sound. No confirmation beyond the subtle shift of the interface. Melanie closed the laptop. Not abruptly, just enough to signal completion. Roman noticed the change without knowing the cause. He had been in the adjacent room reviewing something on his phone, though his attention had not remained consistent. Over the past few days, he had become increasingly aware that there were developments he could not fully track. Not because they were hidden, but because they no longer required his involvement. When Melanie stood and moved toward the kitchen, he looked up. "What are you working on?" he asked. The question was no longer casual. Melanie reached for a glass, filled it with water, and took a small sip before answering. "Documentation," she said. Roman's gaze sharpened slightly. For what? Melanie set the glass down. For legal review. The words were clear, not emphasized. Roman stood, slowly. "You've already talked to a lawyer," he said. It was not a question. Melanie nodded. "Yes." "And now you're sending things?" "Yes." A pause followed, longer than usual. Roman stepped closer. "What exactly are you sending?" he asked. Melanie met his gaze. "A structured summary," she said, "with supporting documents." Roman exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening in a way that was no longer fully concealed. "This is unnecessary," he said. Melanie did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to settle, then replied, "It's already done." Roman looked at her, searching for something and opening a point of adjustment. A way to reframe the situation into something manageable. But the structure had already moved beyond that stage. "You're escalating this," he said. Melanie shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "I'm formalizing it." The distinction remained consistent. Roman turned away briefly, pacing once across the room before stopping. "You could have talked to me first," he said. Melanie's expression did not change. "I did," she replied. Roman stopped, turned back. "That's not the same thing," he said. Melanie held his gaze. It was enough. Silence followed. Not empty, but conclusive, because there was nothing left within that exchange that required continuation. Roman understood that, even if he did not accept it. He looked at her for another moment, then stepped back. The movement was small, but it carried acknowledgement, not agreement, but recognition. Melanie turned away, returning to Ivy's side, adjusting the blanket with the same care she had applied every time before. The house remained quiet, but the quiet had changed again, not because of conflict, but because something had been completed. And completion once reached did not return to uncertainty. That evening, the response from Laura Mitchell did not arrive immediately, nor was it expected to, because process required time. And time in this case was not a delay, it was structure. Melanie did not check her email repeatedly. She did not wait. She continued, feeding, monitoring, recording, because the next phase would not depend on anticipation, only on readiness. And readiness by then was no longer in question. The consequences did not arrive all at once, nor did they present themselves in a way that invited immediate recognition. They moved through channels that were designed to be deliberate, structured, and resistant to sudden change. For Roman Carter, who had spent years navigating systems that rewarded composure and discipline, this should have felt familiar. But familiarity did not mean control. The first indication came through official communication. An email, subject line clear, request for formal review, conduct and financial disclosure. It was sent through internal channels marked with a kind of administrative language that did not accuse directly, but implied that something required examination. Roman read it. Once then, again, his eyes moving more slowly across the text the second time, as if expecting that a different interpretation might emerge. It did not. He was instructed to report for a formal meeting, not informal this time, not exploratory, documented. Roman sat at the edge of the bed for several minutes after reading it. His phone still in his hand, his posture rigid but not composed in the way it had once been. The control he had relied on was still present, but it required more effort now, as if the system around him no longer responded to it with the same ease. Across the room, Melanie moved quietly, preparing Ivy's medication. She did not look at him. She did not ask what he had received. The information did not need to be shared verbally to be understood. Roman stood. "We need to talk," he said. Melanie finished measuring the medication before turning. About what, she asked. Roman hesitated, not because he lacked words, but because he was choosing them. "They're opening a review," he said. "At work." Melanie nodded. "I see." Roman watched her. "You knew this would happen," he said. It was not a question. Melanie met his gaze. "I understood it was possible." Roman exhaled sharply. "This is serious," he said. "It could affect everything." Melanie did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked past him, placing the medication beside Ivy's bassinet, ensuring the timing aligned with the schedule she had already established. Then she spoke. "Yes," she said. "It could." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any elaboration. Roman ran a hand across his forehead. "You didn't have to involve them like this," he said. Melanie turned back toward him. "I didn't involve them," she said. "I provided information." Roman's jaw tightened. "That's the same thing." Melanie shook her head. "No," she said. "It isn't." The distinction remained consistent and increasingly difficult to argue against. Roman looked away, then back. "They're going to look into everything now," he said. "My records, my finances, my conduct." Melanie nodded once. "That's what a review is." Roman's expression shifted, frustration breaking through the controlled surface. "You're acting like this doesn't affect you," he said. Melanie held his gaze. "It does," she said. "Then why?" "Because it already did." She interrupted, her tone still even, but now carrying a clarity that did not invite interruption. Roman stopped. The sentence remained unfinished. Because there was no place for it to go. The formal meeting took place 2 days later. Roman entered the room with the same posture he had practiced for years, shoulders squared, movements, measured expression neutral. But the environment had changed. There were more people present this time. Captain Hayes, a senior administrative officer, a representative from legal oversight. Documents were arranged neatly on the table, not stacked randomly, organized, labeled. Roman recognized the structure immediately, because it mirrored something he had seen before, not in his own life, but in others. Cases where information had already been assembled before the individual was asked to respond. Staff Sergeant Carter Hayes set his tone formal. Roman nodded. "Sir, have a seat." Roman complied. The chair felt different, not physically, but in what it represented. Hayes opened a file. "We're conducting a formal review based on submitted documentation," he said. "This includes financial records, communication logs, and a reported incident involving family welfare." Roman nodded. "Yes, sir." Hayes looked at him. "You'll have the opportunity to respond," he said. "But first, we need to establish the record." Roman remained still. "Yes, sir." The administrative officer began outlining the timeline, each point presented clearly, each supported by documentation. Roman listened. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge, because he understood something critical in that moment. This was no longer a conversation. It was a presentation, and presentations did not adjust based on reaction. When the financial section was introduced, the documents were placed in front of him. He recognized them immediately. The same statements Melanie had reviewed, the same transactions, but now they were contextualized, not as isolated entries, but as part of a pattern. "Can you explain these expenditures?" the officer asked. Roman took a breath. "Yes," he said. Some of these were related to work." "Which ones?" the officer asked. Roman glanced down, then back up. "I'd need to review them in detail," he said. The officer nodded. "You've had that opportunity," he said, tapping the file lightly. Roman did not respond, because the structure allowed no space for general answers. Specificity was required, and specificity required alignment. The audio file was introduced last. Hayes did not play it immediately. Instead, he referenced it. "An audio recording has been submitted," he said. "We've reviewed it. You'll have the chance to address its content." Roman's expression remained controlled. But internally something shifted, because he had not known for certain what had been preserved. Now he did. "Is that your voice?" Hayes asked. Roman paused. "Yes, sir. Is the content accurate?" Another pause, longer. Then, "Yes, sir." The admission was quiet, but definitive. Hayes nodded. "All right," he said. The meeting continued, not aggressively, not emotionally, just systematically. Each section addressed, each response recorded. By the time it concluded, there had been no raised voices, no confrontation, only process. Roman left the room with the same measured steps, but the structure he had once relied on was no longer responsive to him. It had become independent. At home, Melanie continued her routine without interruption. She did not ask about the meeting. She did not need to, because the outcome was not dependent on his description, only on the record. Roman entered the house later that evening. His movements were slower, less controlled, not chaotic, but no longer precise. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "They've reviewed everything," he said. Melanie looked up. "I assumed they would." Roman exhaled. "They're moving forward," he said. "There will be consequences." Melanie nodded. "Yes." Roman watched her. "You don't seem surprised." Melanie met his gaze. "I'm not." Silence followed. Roman stepped further into the room. "They're questioning my judgment," he said. "My conduct, my financial decisions." Melanie listened, without interruption, without reaction. "They're looking at everything," he added. Melanie nodded again. "That's what a review does." Roman's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. Because there was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to reframe. The system had moved forward, and it would continue to do so, with or without his agreement. Melanie turned back to Ivy, checked her temperature, recorded it in the notebook. Routine, stable, necessary. Behind her, Roman remained still. Because for the first time, the consequences of his actions were not being argued. They were being processed. And process once established did not require permission. Only time. That night, the house remained quiet. But the quiet no longer felt suspended. It felt settled. Because what had begun as observation had moved fully into outcome. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The final hearing did not feel like a climax in the way people often imagine such moments. There was no dramatic entrance, no visible tension in the air that could be measured or named. Instead, it unfolded within a room designed for process quiet, structured, and indifferent to personal narratives that could not be supported by record. Melanie Carter arrived early, not because she was anxious, but because she preferred time to settle into the space before anything began. The courthouse was functional in its design, with long corridors, muted tones, and the constant low presence of movement that never fully stopped. People entered and exited rooms, carrying folders, documents, and conversations that were contained rather than expressed. She sat in a chair near the far wall, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her posture steady. Beside her, Laura Mitchell reviewed a set of documents, though not with urgency. Everything that needed to be prepared had already been organized days before. "This will be straightforward," Laura said quietly without looking up. "There's no advantage in speaking more than necessary." Melanie nodded. "I understand." Laura glanced at her briefly. "You've done everything correctly," she added. "Now we let the structure do its work." Melanie did not respond. She did not need reassurance, only clarity. Across the room, Roman Carter entered with his legal representative. His posture remained controlled, though the effort required to maintain it had increased. There were no outward signs of instability, but the subtle adjustments slightly delayed movements. A more deliberate pace indicated that control was no longer automatic. He saw Melanie, paused. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to register. Melanie did not react. Her gaze remained steady, not avoiding him, but not engaging either. Because this was no longer a space for interaction. It was a space for presentation. The hearing began without ceremony. The judge entered, everyone stood, then sat. The process moved forward. Case identification, names confirmed, representation acknowledged. Laura spoke first. Her tone was measured, her language precise. "We are presenting a structured record of events supported by documentation," she said. "This includes financial discrepancies, documented absence during a medical emergency involving a minor child, and supporting communication records." There was no embellishment, no emphasis beyond what was necessary. The documents were submitted, not dramatically, just placed into the record. Roman's attorney responded, attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. A period of stress, a misinterpretation of intent. The language was careful, constructed, but it relied on something the structure no longer supported: ambiguity. Laura did not interrupt. She waited, then responded. "The documentation does not rely on interpretation," she said. "It relies on alignment." She referenced the timeline, the financial records, the audio file, each element introduced without exaggeration, each connected without assumption. The judge reviewed the materials, not quickly, but thoroughly. Time moved differently in that room, not rushed, not delayed, just deliberate. When Roman was asked to speak, he stood. His posture remained correct, his voice steady. But the content had shifted. He did not deny the events. He did not challenge the records. Instead, he attempted to contextualize them. "There were circumstances," he said, "pressures that affected my decisions. The statement was not incorrect, but it was incomplete." The judge listened, then asked, "Were you present at the hospital during your child's intake?" Roman paused. "No," he said. "Did you return within a reasonable time frame?" Another pause. "No." "Were funds used for non-household expenses while medical bills remained unpaid?" Roman exhaled slightly. "Yes." Each answer was simple, direct, because there was no alternative that aligned with the record. The questions did not accuse. They clarified, and clarification, once completed, did not require interpretation. Melanie was not required to speak extensively. Laura handled most of the presentation. But at one point, she was asked a single question. "Have you attempted to resolve this through direct communication?" Melanie stood. Her posture steady. "Yes," she said. "Through observation and documentation." The answer was brief, but sufficient. because it reflected the process she had followed from the beginning. No escalation, no confrontation, only record. She sat. The moment passed. But its significance remained. The decision was not delivered immediately. There was a brief recess. Time for review. Time for alignment. Melanie remained seated, her hands still, her breathing even. Across the room, Roman spoke quietly with his attorney. His movements more animated now, less controlled, because the outcome was no longer something he could shape, only something he would receive. Laura leaned slightly toward Melanie. "This will conclude as expected," she said. Melanie nodded. She did not ask what that meant, because expectation in this case had already been defined by the record. When the hearing resumed, the decision was delivered in the same tone that had defined everything else. Measured, clear, without emphasis. Primary custody was granted to Melanie. Financial responsibilities were outlined, structured, enforceable. Roman was assigned obligations, not as punishment, but as consequence. The language did not reference betrayal. It did not reference intention, only action and alignment. Roman stood as the decision concluded. His posture remained upright, but the identity he had maintained, the controlled, composed, reliable structure, had shifted, not collapsed, but altered, because it no longer aligned with the record. He looked toward Melanie, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something quieter, recognition. Melanie met his gaze briefly, then looked away, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to exchange. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, not lighter, but less contained. People moved more freely, conversations resumed, life continued. Laura gathered the documents. "You're done," she said. Melanie nodded. "Yes." Laura studied her for a moment. "Most people expect to feel something more at this point," she said. Melanie considered that, then replied, "I feel finished." Laura nodded. "That's enough." Roman exited the building separately. He did not approach Melanie. He did not speak, because the space for conversation had closed. Not through conflict, but through completion. Melanie walked to her car, unlocked it, placed her bag inside, then paused for a moment before getting in. Not to reflect, not to reconsider, just to acknowledge that what had begun in a hospital corridor in silence had reached its conclusion in the same way. Without noise, without spectacle, just structure. She got into the car, closed the door, and drove away. Back at the house, Ivy slept in the same bassinet, her breathing steady, her condition no longer fragile in the way it had been. Melanie moved through the space with the same quiet precision. But something had changed. Not externally, internally. The process was no longer ongoing. It had reached its end. And endings, when built correctly, did not require celebration, only acceptance. The house did not change all at once. There was no singular moment when everything felt different, no visible line that separated what had been from what now remained. Instead, the transformation unfolded gradually through absence, more than presence, through the removal of patterns that had once defined the space. Roman Carter no longer entered through the front door with the same controlled rhythm that had once shaped every evening. His keys no longer rested in their designated place. His voice, measured and deliberate, no longer filled the quiet with carefully constructed explanations. What remained was not emptiness. It was clarity. Melanie Carter moved through the house with the same precision she had maintained throughout the process, but now her actions were no longer aligned with response. They were aligned with intention. Boxes appeared first. Not many, just enough. Placed neatly along the hallway, each labeled in a way that reflected the same structure she had applied to everything else. Documents, medical, personal, Ivy. There was no urgency in how she packed. No abrupt decisions. Each item was considered, then placed. What remained behind was not discarded out of anger. It was left because it no longer belonged to her. The distinction mattered. Ivy's routine continued without interruption. Morning feeding, medication, temperature check, sleep. Melanie followed each step with the same attention she had always given, but now there was no secondary awareness, no monitoring of another person's movement, no anticipation of absence or inconsistency. Only presence, only what was necessary. The first night in the new apartment was quiet in a different way. Not the contained silence of tension, not the measured stillness of observation, but something softer, less defined. The space was smaller, simpler, but it held no contradictions. Melanie placed Ivy's bassinet near the window, where natural light would reach it in the morning. She arranged the essentials first: clothing, supplies, documents, everything in its place. Not because it had to be, but because she preferred it that way. There was no need to rush, no pressure to complete everything immediately. The process of settling in was not separate from the life she had already been living. It was a continuation. That evening, after Ivy had fallen asleep, Melanie sat near the window with a notebook in her hands. The same notebook, the one that had held dates, times, observations. She opened it, flipped through the pages. Each entry remained as it had been written. Unchanged, accurate, a record of something that no longer required continuation. She reached the final page, paused, then wrote one last entry. Transition complete. No elaboration, no summary, just closure. She closed the notebook, set it aside. Not hidden, not displayed, simply placed. Rohrman remained in the house they had once shared. The structure of his life had not disappeared. It had shifted. Responsibilities remained. Obligations, now defined more clearly than before, required adherence. Schedules, payments, expectations that were no longer flexible. He moved through his days with the same discipline he had always relied on, but without the ability to adjust perception in the way he once had. Because perception now was no longer the primary structure. Record was, and record did not respond. He saw Ivy according to the arrangement established. Structured visits, defined time, no deviation. When he held her, his movements were careful, measured, not because he lacked concern, but because he understood that every action now existed within a framework that extended beyond him. Melanie did not interfere. She did not supervise unnecessarily. She did not comment, because the system in place did not require her to manage him, only to maintain consistency. Their interactions, when they occurred, were minimal, functional, exchange of information. Nothing more. There were no attempts at reconciliation, no revisiting of past conversations, no effort to redefine what had already been concluded. Because the conclusion did not depend on agreement. It depended on completion. Weeks passed, then months. The rhythm stabilized. Ivy grew stronger, her health no longer fragile in the way it had once been. Her presence filled the space with a different kind of attention, one that did not require vigilance, only care. Melanie adapted to the new structure with the same quiet strength she had carried throughout the process. Work, home, routine. There was no visible transformation, no dramatic shift in identity, only continuity. Because what she had built was not new. It was revealed. One afternoon, as light filtered through the window and settled across the floor in the same quiet pattern she had once observed in a different home, Melanie stood by the desk and looked at the folder labeled Legal. It remained complete, organized, closed. She did not open it. She did not need to, because everything it contained had already moved beyond her. Into outcome, into structure, into resolution. She placed her hand lightly on the edge of the desk, not as a gesture of reflection, but of acknowledgement. Then she turned away. There was no moment of triumph, no sense of victory that required recognition, because nothing had been won, only resolved. And resolution, when achieved without noise, often felt quieter than expected. But it carried something else, something more stable. Not satisfaction, not relief, but space. Space that had not existed before. Space that did not need to be defended, only lived in. That evening, Melanie sat with Ivy in her arms, the child's breathing steady against her shoulder. The room was quiet, but not empty. The quiet held presence, consistency, a future that no longer depended on interpretation. Only on continuation, Melanie looked out the window. Not searching, not waiting, just observing. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to document. Nothing left to prove, nothing left to resolve. Only life. And life, when no longer shaped by someone else's inconsistency, did not need to be explained. It simply moved forward, quietly, completely. She adjusted Ivy's blanket slightly, rested her hand gently along the child's back, and remained there, not as someone who had endured, not as someone who had overcome, but as someone who had completed something, without noise, without spectacle, with dignity. Some stories do not end with raised voices or visible victories. They do not conclude in moments designed to be witnessed or applauded. Instead, they settle into something quieter, something that can only be recognized after everything has already been put in its place. What happened to Melanie Carter was not defined by a single act of betrayal, nor by the moment her husband chose to walk away from a hospital room. Those moments mattered, but they were not the whole story. What defined it was what followed the decision to observe, rather than react to document, rather than argue. To build something structured out of something that had once been uncertain. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not interrupt. It does not demand attention. It works quietly in the background, aligning facts, preserving truth, and allowing time to reveal what emotion alone cannot hold steady. Justice in this kind of story does not arrive as punishment. It arrives as clarity, as consequence, as a system that reflects actions without distortion. And dignity does not come from proving someone else wrong. It comes from no longer needing to. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on where you are and what time it is where you're listening from. These quiet moments connect more than we realize. And if you find meaning in stories like this, stories about truth restraint and the kind of strength that doesn't need to speak loudly, you're always welcome to stay, to listen, and to return.